You know, people always say that kindness is never wasted, but I'm here to tell you that sometimes kindness can become a prison of your own making. I learned this lesson at 73 years old, and it nearly killed me before it set me free. I moved to Maple Street 15 years ago, after Harold passed. The little yellow house seemed perfect for my golden years. The Hendersons lived next door in a sprawling colonial that had seen better days. Janet Henderson was about my age, a widow struggling with the upkeep of that big house. My mother raised me to be helpful, so when Janet mentioned trouble reaching high branches on her apple tree, I offered to have my yard service handle it. When she sighed about grocery shopping becoming a burden, I suggested giving me her list. These small gestures seemed to brighten her whole demeanor, and it felt good to be needed again after Harold's death. What started as occasional favors gradually became expected routine. Grocery runs turned into weekly expeditions where Janet's list grew longer and more specific. Special bread from across town, organic produce from the farmer's market, medications from a pharmacy 20 minutes away. I spent entire Saturdays driving all over the county, filling Janet's needs while my own errands got pushed aside. The yard work expanded too. My landscaping crew spent as much time on her property as mine. When I mentioned she might contribute to the cost, she looked so hurt, reminding me she was on a fixed income, not blessed with a pension like I had been. Then came the handyman requests. Janet discovered a new household crisis every few weeks: a leaky faucet, a squeaky door, a broken light fixture. She would call in tears, talking about how she couldn't afford to hire someone. I would end up calling my reliable handyman Bill, who would squeeze in Janet's emergencies as a favor to me. The financial requests started small: $20 for a doctor's copay, $50 for an unexpected repair, $100 for her heating bill. She always promised to pay me back, always had reasonable explanations, and I always told her not to worry about it. But it wasn't just money or time. Janet's needs began to eclipse everything in my life. Sunday dinners with my sister got canceled when Janet's cable went out. Book club meetings became hit or miss because Janet needed emergency trips to the store. My own doctor's appointments got rescheduled when Janet's crises took precedence. I started living two lives. There was Margaret Ellis, a woman with her own interests, and Janet's lifeline, her personal assistant and ATM. The first life kept shrinking while the second expanded to fill every available hour. Other neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Patterson would give me pointed looks when she saw me carrying Janet's groceries again. Tom Bradley started making comments about Janet finding herself a good deal. Even Bill Morrison asked if Janet ever planned to pay for her own repairs. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in late October. I had been feeling under the weather, planning to take it easy with soup and reading. That morning, Janet called in tears. She had fallen in her bathroom and needed to go to the emergency room to get checked out. The emergency room wait was brutal. Nearly 4 hours, while Janet alternated between dramatic retellings of her fall and complaints about hospital inefficiency. The doctor found nothing wrong beyond minor bruising, but the ordeal took the entire day. I had barely gotten home when Janet called again. She was too rattled to cook and wondered if I might pick up dinner from that Italian place she liked. I explained I wasn't feeling well and suggested delivery, but she said she didn't have money for delivery and tips. And besides, the restaurant didn't deliver to our neighborhood. I should have said no. Instead, I dragged myself back out into the cold October night, drove 20 minutes to Giuseppe's, waited another 20 for her chicken piccata and tiramisu, and delivered it to her door. Janet barely thanked me, too busy inspecting the food and complaining that the chicken looked dry. The next morning, I woke up with fever and chills. I called my doctor and got an afternoon appointment, then settled into bed hoping to rest. At 10:30, Janet called. She needed to go grocery shopping and could I drive her since she was still nervous about driving after her fall. I told her I was sick and had a doctor's appointment. There was a pause. Then Janet's wounded tone. She said she understood I was tired, but she really couldn't drive herself, and it would just be a quick trip. She reminded me she had been through real trauma and needed support from friends. She suggested fresh air might be good for me. Something inside me snapped. Maybe it was the fever, Or maybe 15 years of giving had finally emptied me out completely. But I heard myself saying words I had never said to Janet before. I told her no. I told her I was sick, going to the doctor, and she would have to find another way to get to the store. I told her that her fall had been minor according to the doctor, that she was perfectly capable of driving, and I would not be available to help her today, or possibly for several days. The silence stretched so long I thought she had hung up. Then came the explosion. Janet's voice turned sharp and cold as she told me how disappointed she was, how she had thought I was a true friend, but apparently I was selfish and unreliable. She said she couldn't believe I would abandon her when she needed me most. Then she said the words that would echo in my mind for weeks. Maybe she had been wrong about me from the beginning, that maybe I had only been helping her to make myself feel important, and that a truly good person would put a friend's needs ahead of their own minor sniffles. I hung up and sat staring at the phone for a long time. In all my years of helping Janet, supporting her, rearranging my life around her needs, this was how she saw me. Not as a generous friend, but as someone whose motives were selfish, whose help came with strings attached. Later that day, after my doctor confirmed I had the flu, I sat in my quiet house and really looked at my life. When was the last time I had done something purely for my own enjoyment? When had I last said yes to an invitation without checking if Janet needed something? When had I spent my own money on something I wanted instead of something Janet needed? I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being Margaret Ellis and become Janet Henderson's unpaid personal assistant. I had traded my identity for the temporary warmth of being needed. The next week, while I recovered, Janet called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. Her messages started apologetic, explaining she had been upset and hadn't meant what she said. When I didn't call back, her tone shifted to irritation and manipulation. She reminded me she was all alone with no one else to turn to. By the end of the week, I realized I felt better than I had in months, and it wasn't just because my flu symptoms were gone. The constant stress of wondering what Janet might need next had disappeared. For the first time in years, my time was my own. When I felt strong enough to venture outside, I was working in my front garden when Janet appeared at the fence. She looked older, more fragile, and for a moment, I felt the familiar tug of sympathy. She launched into a speech about how worried she had been, how sorry she was for our misunderstanding, how much she had missed having me to rely on. She brought store-bought cookies arranged on her own dish. It was such a Janet gesture, offering something that looked generous but required no real effort. As she talked, I realized she was following a script we had performed dozens of times. She would apologize just enough to make me feel guilty, remind me how much she needed me, then gradually ramp back up to her previous demands. Historically, I had played my part perfectly, but this time felt different. I could see the performance for what it was. Janet's distress was real, but also wielded as a tool. Her apologies were calculated to restore the status quo, not acknowledge genuine wrongdoing. I thanked her for the cookies but told her I needed to be honest. I explained that I had realized during my illness that I had been overextending myself and needed to make changes. While I still cared about her as a neighbor, I couldn't continue being her primary source of support for everything. Janet's face went through confusion, hurt, anger, then familiar manipulation. She reminded me she was all alone with health problems, that her fixed income made it impossible to hire help. She said she had thought we were real friends, and real friends helped each other without keeping score. I told her that real friends also respected boundaries and didn't expect one person to carry all the weight. I suggested she look into senior services available in our county, programs designed to help older adults with transportation and household tasks. Our church had a volunteer network that could connect her with rotating help. Janet's response was swift and cutting. She was disappointed in how selfish I had become. Never would have expected this from me. If this was how I really felt, maybe it was better she knew what kind of person I really was. She took her cookies and walked back without another word. I stood there in my garden and waited for the familiar wave of guilt. I waited to feel terrible about hurting Janet's feelings, about being selfish, about failing as a friend. But the guilt didn't come. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: relief. The weight of Janet's constant needs had been lifted from my shoulders. I felt like I could breathe again. The following weeks tested my resolve. Janet tried several approaches to restore our old dynamic. She left a note saying she had fallen again and needed help getting to the doctor. When I didn't respond, she called my sister Carol, saying she was worried I was having some kind of breakdown. Carol called me concerned, and we had a long conversation about what had been happening. As I described Janet's demands and my responses over the years, I could hear Carol's growing amazement. She asked why I had never told her how much I was doing for Janet, and I realized it was because some part of me had known it wasn't healthy. Janet's attempts continued for weeks. She would wave cheerfully as if nothing had happened, then call asking for small favors, testing if I was still holding firm. Each time, I politely but firmly declined or redirected her to find alternative solutions. Meanwhile, I started reclaiming my life. I signed up for watercolor classes I had been putting off. I accepted Carol's standing invitation for Sunday dinners. I rejoined book club enthusiastically and started hosting meetings again. I made new friends who treated me as an equal, not a resource to be tapped. I also examined my finances. When I added up what I had spent on Janet over the years, the number was staggering. The money could have funded several vacations or home improvements I had been putting off. The transformation wasn't just practical but emotional. The constant anxiety began to fade. I stopped jumping when the phone rang, stopped checking my windows to see if Janet needed something, stopped feeling guilty for enjoying my own life. About 3 months later, I ran into Janet at the grocery store. She looked well, better than she had in months, chatting animatedly with another neighborhood woman. When she saw me, she gave a polite nod but didn't approach. She had found other sources of support and was managing fine without me. This should have been relief, but I found myself slightly hurt. Had I been so easily replaced? It took me a moment to recognize this as my ego objecting to being unnecessary. The truth was, Janet had survived fine without me because she had never been as helpless as she pretended. Her crises had been largely manufactured, designed to create urgency and obligation in others. She had been perfectly capable of solving her own problems. She had simply found it more convenient to have someone else do it. Spring arrived early that year, bringing renewal I hadn't felt in decades. My garden, which I now had time to properly tend, bloomed more beautifully than it had in years. My watercolor skills were improving, and I had even sold pieces at the local artists' cooperative. One evening in April, as I sat on my porch with tea and a library book, Janet appeared at our fence. She looked nervous, and I braced myself for another manipulation attempt. Instead, she surprised me with a genuine apology, not designed to restore the status quo, but real acknowledgement of how she had treated me. She said she had gotten used to relying on me for everything and hadn't realized how unfair that had become. Learning to manage on her own had been harder than expected, but also empowering. She didn't ask for anything, didn't hint at wanting to restore our old dynamic. She simply said she was sorry and hoped I was doing well. Then she went back to her house, leaving me surprised by this genuine change. As summer approached, I reflected on the lessons this experience had taught me. Kindness without boundaries isn't actually kindness but enablement. Saying no to unreasonable demands isn't selfish but necessary. Being needed and being used are very different things. Most importantly, I learned it was never too late to reclaim your life. Even at 73, the patterns that felt permanent could be transformed with courage and determination. These days, I help people differently. I volunteer at the Literacy Center, participate in the church's meal program as part of a team, help neighbors occasionally within clear boundaries. Janet and I are now what we should have been from the beginning: polite, friendly neighbors who help each other in genuine emergencies. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had never found courage to set boundaries. I probably would have continued enabling her dependency while sacrificing my well-being, growing more resentful and exhausted each year. Instead, I'm healthier and happier at 75 than I was at 70. I wake up excited about my day, make plans without anxiety, spend money on myself without guilt, and say no to requests that don't serve me without apologizing. The yellow house did become my sanctuary, just not as I expected. It became the place where I learned to value myself enough to defend my boundaries, where I discovered that protecting my peace was more important than avoiding conflict. That's the legacy I want to leave now, not as someone who sacrificed everything for others, but as someone who learned that caring for yourself isn't selfish but essential. At 75, I'm finally living my life instead of managing everyone else's. And let me tell you, it's a beautiful thing to behold.